Hello, everybody. Welcome to our roundtable this afternoon or this evening, depending on where you're sitting. I'm Gabriel Rosenfeld, professor of history and director of the Judaic Studies program at Fairfield University. For the past 7 years, moreover, I've been an editor here at the JHR, together with my colleagues Michal Aharoni, Stefan Ihrig, and Aryeh Kochavi. And it's in this capacity that I'd like to welcome everyone this afternoon or evening to our online Zoom forum, Confronting Hatred. Our forum today is going to be closely linked to the next forthcoming issue of the Journal of Holocaust Research, which, truth be told, should be out today, potentially will be out while we're actually having this conversation. And the issue is of some note. It actually features marvelous contributions by all of our gathered speakers today. We'll be hearing quite a bit from them in the course of our discussion. But before we get started, I'd like to thank a couple of people just for helping to coordinate this afternoon's event. Anat Weiner at the JHR, Alexa Asher as well. They were incredibly helpful at bringing quite a big group together, which is no mean feat. Alexa also wanted me to mention that she'll be posting a link to the JHR in the chat portion of the menu bar. So if you would like to access the journal at any point in time, you can feel free to do that. But let us begin. There is a backstory to this afternoon's conversation. It is of some relevance. So in order to provide a little bit more detail, I'd like to turn things over to my good friend and colleague, Janet Ward, who I think is safe to say is the guiding force behind today's event in her capacity as the guest editor. If you don't yet know Janet, you need to get to know her. She is the Brammer Presidential Professor. More importantly, the current president of the German Studies Association. She is, as I like to say, someone who makes things happen. So please do get to know Janet one way or the other. She will be able to now turn our attention to not only the introductions of our panelists, but also a little bit, she can tell us a little bit more about how this special issue and today's forum came to be. So Janet, if you could be so kind as to give everybody a couple more details.
Thank you so much, Gabriel. And thank you to the editorial staff at the Journal of Holocaust Research for making today's webinar possible. As moderator of today's event and as editor of the special issue, it's my great pleasure to welcome our panelists, aka our contributors, and all of you here today. In his 2017 Amazon best-selling book, On Tyranny, 20 Lessons from the 20th Century, historian Timothy Snyder usefully advocated that we, quote, take responsibility for the face of the world and notice the swastikas and the other signs of hate. Mindful of this need for a more effective scholar-activist approach, the 6 wide-ranging, courageous, and forthright contributions to our special issue have done just this. They will help inspire the Journal of Holocaust Research readership and our audience in today's webinar to mobilize against these signs. The contributors to our volume, Confronting Hatred, Neo-Nazism, Antisemitism, and Holocaust Studies Today, first presented at events organized by Gabriel Rosenfeld and myself, including a seminar at a conference of the German Studies Association in October 2019 in Portland, Oregon, and at a roundtable of the American Historical Association's annual meeting in January 2020. By inviting a group of German and American scholars to collaborate, I should say also British, right, Heidi? We mustn't sort of get totally subsumed within this. Sometimes I do that about my own identity, but you know, we're hybrid. By inviting a group of international scholars to collaborate and explore the complicated continuities between the fascist past and today, amid the rise of populism, racism, anti-Semitism, and white ethno-nationalism in the United States, Germany, and beyond, we have deepened our collective understanding of the ongoing connections and challenges for our teaching, our scholarship, and most importantly, our public outreach. Let us look upon today's webinar as an act of public outreach that brings together scholarship and new publics. That's what, in a way, we're all learning how to do in the age of the pandemic. Today, each panelist will spend a few minutes reflecting on the experience, the message, and the impact of what they wrote for this special issue. These are, in fact, the all-important what, so what, and now what questions and reflections about one's work. especially in this era when we know the stakes are so very high. I'll introduce the speakers and they'll each respond for a few minutes before we move to the Q&A. Your role in the Q&A, please, is very important. Please start it straight away. Please type in your questions, add your name, add your location if you so wish. And we look forward to the second part where this becomes a roundtable discussion amongst the panelists and in response to all your questions and comments. So our first speaker today, just for 5 minutes, is Robert Tobin, whose contribution to the journal is The Evolian Imagination, Gender, Race and Class, from Fascism to the New Right. Now, Robert Dean Tobin holds the Henry J. Lyer Chair at Clark University in Massachusetts, where he researches at the intersections of German studies and LGBTQ+ studies. He is the author of 3 books, Warm Brothers, Queer Theory and the Age of Goethe, as well as Doctor's Orders, Goethe and Enlightenment Science, and also Peripheral Desires, the German Discovery of Sex. His current project, tentatively entitled Freedom and Friendship, looks at how sexuality has affected the politics of men who love men from the Enlightenment until now. Mostly, he says, in a liberal direction, sometimes in a leftist direction, and occasionally in a far-right direction, which is how he stumbled upon the writings of Julius Evola. In fact, rather than simply introduce all of you right now, why don't we just start with your 5 minutes, please, Robert.
Okay, that sounds like a good strategy.
Dive in. Thank you.
Very good. Everyone can see and hear me, right? So let me get started. In 2017, shortly after Donald Trump was elected, the New York Times reported that his advisor, Stephen Bannon, had quoted an obscure Italian fascist thinker named Julius Evola at a 2014 conference at the Vatican. This was part of the press's new interest in the so-called alt-right in American politics, which had connections with the European New Right and other groups that were sometimes called the radical or the far right. These people seemed different from the typical Trump supporter about whom the media had been writing. We were getting a lot of stories about disenfranchised working class men and women from the middle of the country, neglected by the coastal elites. But these thinkers on the alt and new right claimed to be intellectuals and were engaging in the world of ideas. Despite their disdain for cosmopolitanism, they seemed to be part of a worldwide network. Structurally, they reminded me of the intellectual cliques I studied from the age of Goethe, or the early 20th century, full of infighting, sectarianism, and melodramatic gestures by now forgotten figures. As I fell down this rabbit hole of alt-right thinkers, all signs kept pointing me back to Julius Evola. As Alain de Benoit, a founding father of France's Nouvelle Droite, wrote, quote, "There is no doubt that the Evolian political thought has, above all, seduced all the currents related directly or indirectly to the radical right, including fascists, national socialists, monarchists, and reactionary Catholics." One of Evola's most distinctive strategies was to apply a kind of Platonic ideal to questions of race, gender, and class. Race would not be a purely biological matter, as he asserted that the German race theorists argued, but rather also had a psychological or spiritual component. This became useful after the Second World War, as far-right thinkers wanted to distance themselves from the Holocaust. It was much more palatable in liberal society to object to groups of people based on their culture and mentality, rather than on the genetic and biological accident of their birth. Similar thinking applied to gender, which particularly interested me as a scholar whose primary focus is sexuality studies, because Evola drew on early figures in the German homosexual rights movement. His thinking on class also helps clarify what he was getting at. He preferred the concept of caste because a person was admittedly born into a certain caste, but also had to be initiated into the caste and trained to perform its duties. In all 3 cases, there could be mismatches, often caused by intermarriage, which would produce half-hysterical beings, romantic, tragic, torn, restless souls, always on the search for new truths. Those are all quotes by him. Now, why is this important? Well, because people who admitted an interest in Evola and his fascist philosophies suddenly came awfully close to power in recent years. The Golden Dawn, for a while the third largest party in Greece, placed him first on a list of recommended readings. In Hungary, Gábor Vona, who led Jobbik, the party to the right of Viktor Orban's already right-wing party Fidesz, wrote the foreword to a collection of Evola's essays. In Brazil, the philosopher Olavo de Carvalho, frequently compared with Evola, advised the President Bolsonaro and was a mentor to his erstwhile Secretary of State. In Russia, the philosopher Alexander Dugin was and is a big fan of Evola and is also involved with think tanks that support Vladimir Putin. And of course, in the United States, Stephen Bannon had the ears of the president at least for a while. Now, of course, this authoritarian illiberal tide has receded somewhat in the last year. All of those people I mentioned, many of them are out of office. I'll skip them in the interest of time. So it might seem that we can rest assured. Indeed, perhaps one is helping these authors. Perhaps I am helping these authors gain a more stable footing by treating them as serious thinkers. But the fact that these intellectuals were able, from the 1950s to the 2010s, to gather and develop a coherent philosophy that provided the ideological framework for political parties that have been so successful should be a warning that these same ideas could be back tomorrow. To borrow a phrase from Hillary Rodham Clinton, there is a vast right-wing conspiracy of far-right think tanks and presses supported by wealthy donors and some governments. We need to study the intellectual origins of the alt, new, far, and radical right, both to recognize their presence in the rhetoric of right-wing parties and to confront them head-on when the occasion arises. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Robert. That was a powerful beginning. We are now turning to our second contributor in the journal special issue, Michelle Lynn Kahn's article entitled The American Influence on German Nazism, An Entangled History of Hate, 1970s to the 1990s. Michelle Lynn Kahn is an assistant professor of modern European history at the University of Richmond, specializing in post-1945 Germany. She has a particular interest in far-right extremism, racism, and anti-Semitism, as well as Holocaust memory, migration, gender, sexuality, and transnational connections. She's currently completing a book on the history of Turkish guest worker migration to Germany, as well as researching a new project, about which we'll hear today, on the transatlantic entanglements between US and German neo-Nazis. She was awarded the 2019 Fritz Stern Dissertation Prize of the German Historical Institute, and her research has also been funded by the Alexander von Humboldt Foundation and the Central European History Society. Over to you, Michelle.
Thank you so much, Janet. Hi, everyone. Thanks also to Gav and to all the JHR editors and everyone who's been helping. My article for the special issue is part of a new book project that I'm working on the connections of German neo-Nazis to neo-Nazis across the globe, including particularly American neo-Nazis from the 1970s through the 1990s. And what I do particularly in this article is show that it was United States neo-Nazis that had an especially pronounced and important influence on German neo-Nazis between the 1970s and the 1990s. And I focus here on one particular organization, and I will share some slides now so you can kind of get a sense of like the color and the iconography of everything that they're doing. So let's see, play from current slide. The organization that I focus on in this article is called the NSDAP-AO, which was founded in 1972. This is the National Socialist Auslands- und Aufbauorganisation, or in English, the Foreign Organization. This was not a German organization. In fact, as you can see here in the picture of the membership card on the right, that it says official supporter and party officer in English. And that is because this organization was actually headquartered in the United States in Lincoln, Nebraska. Very, very random, seemingly, but it's located in Lincoln, Nebraska. And between the 70s and the 1990s, this organization actually became the largest purveyor and shipper of Nazi propaganda materials to Germany, and particularly to West Germany, because this was during the Cold War, and that's the country, the divided half of Germany, to which they had the most access. These propaganda materials were largely self-produced by the NSDAP-AO. On the left, you can see their regular monthly newsletter, the NS Kampfruf, or the NS Battle Cry, which had a very catchy rhyming slogan, Trotz Verbot nicht tot, despite the ban, not dead. So they shipped all of these newsletters, tons and tons of them, across the Atlantic Ocean to Germany. And also on the right, you can see these stickers, all sorts of different kinds of stickers with the swastika, of course, and different slogans saying death to the Red Front, we're back, foreigners out, and down with the ban on National Socialism in West Germany. And how did they get these materials? Well, they shipped them literally through the US and German postal office. As you can see at the bottom of each of these stickers, they literally have a post office box in Lincoln, Nebraska. I believe it's the same post office box today that materials were getting shipped back and forth from. So this was a very old school style operation. There were thousands of people involved in this operation. I'd be happy to go into more detail on any of this later, but there were two men who were key to its success. On the left is Gerhard, or Gary Lauck, also known as the Farm Belt Führer. Lauck was the founder of the NSDAP-AO. He founded it in 1972 when he was just 19 years old. He'd grown up in Wisconsin, moved to Nebraska, and even though he was an American citizen from the Midwest, he admired the Third Reich so much that he grew a Hitler mustache, changed his name to Gerhard, and even started speaking with a German accent. But he wasn't able to do it alone. He needed a right-hand man in Germany, and that right-hand man was Michael Kühnen. Kühnen was the most important German neo-Nazi, particularly in the 1980s, and he was instrumental in developing the covert cells of neo-Nazis in Germany who would pick up this propaganda shipped from Nebraska and distribute it all throughout West Germany. In the 1990s, this organization, the NSDAP-AO, began to decline, and this was due in large part to the rise of the internet, which in the founder Lauck's own words, he said made his method of shipping propaganda, quote, crude, outdated, and obsolete. But Lauck and the NSDAP-AO quickly adapted to the internet age. Still today, they maintain multiple websites, all depicted here. So many websites on the internet. It's very disturbing to browse through these things. A regular, nsdap.info website with information about the Third Reich. On the right, you can see their website, Third Reich Books, where they actually produce, publish, and sell English language translations, and in many other language translations of books from the Nazi period. He operates a website on the bottom left-hand corner called censurfrei.com, which means censorship-free website where people can host neo-Nazi websites without having to worry about censorship. And of course, on the bottom left, his Twitter. Okay, so I want to offer several main takeaways here. The first takeaway is that we need to reevaluate the US-German relationship after World War II. There's this triumphalist narrative whereby America successfully denazified Germany, but I want to argue here that there were American actors who were certainly involved in the renazification of Germany in terms of shoring up its neo-Nazi movements. The other takeaway is that we need to put more effort into writing far-right history beyond borders. In the case of Germany, neo-Nazism was not just a homegrown phenomenon or a continuation or legacy of the Third Reich, but rather it resurged and was reinvigorated in large part due to transnational and global networks. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Michelle. We're turning now to the next contributor in the special issue, whose article is entitled Fighting Hate with Speech Law, Media and German Visions of Democracy. Heidi Tworek is Associate Professor of History and Public Policy at the University of British Columbia in Vancouver, and her work focuses on the history of communications and media policy. Dr. Tworek's book, News from Germany, The Competition to Control World Communications, 1900 to 1945, received the Wiener Library's Frankel Prize in 2019, and also the Ralph Gomery Prize from the Business History Conference and Alfred P. Sloan Foundation. She has also edited a couple of volumes, Exorbitant Expectations, International Organizations and the Media in the 19th and 20th Century, and The Rutledge Companion to the Makers of Global Business. Dr. Tworek has written multiple public policy reports in media and communications, and she's a senior fellow at the Center for International Governance Innovation, as well as a non-resident fellow of the German Marshall Fund of the United States and of the Canadian Global Affairs Institute. Over to you, Heidi.
Thanks so much, Janet. Thank you for steering us through this, and also to Gav and everybody at the Journal of Holocaust Research. It's such a pleasure to be here and to also think back upon the times when we discuss these things in person, which hopefully will return sometime soon. So this piece really gave me the opportunity to put into historical context a law passed in Germany in 2018 about which a great deal had already been written. So in 2018, Germany passed a law that was called the Netzwerkdurchsetzungsgesetz, or the Network Enforcement Law, commonly and mistakenly known as a hate speech law in English. This in fact enforces 22 statutes of German speech law online, requiring the major social media companies with more than 2 million unique users in Germany to attend to or delete potentially within 24 hours any posts that German users flag as contravening these 22 statutes of German speech law. Commonly known as NetzDG, this law was not just something that inspired people within Germany, but also was widely discussed amongst policymakers all around the world, because it was seen as the first law that was really pushing back against the apparently overweening power of social media companies that were primarily based in the United States. And this was particularly seen as concerning in Germany after the election of Donald Trump and the large amount of hate speech that also seemed to draw on terms from the Nazi era like Lügenpresse or Systempresse that had long been deemed to be obsolete. And so this law was intended to ensure that German ideas around speech were actually enforced within Germany itself. So as I've said, this law had been written about quite extensively by communications scholars, internet lawyers, and others who had looked at the law in its own terms within the present. Did it actually function? How did its mechanisms work, like transparency reports, et cetera, et cetera? I myself had actually written some policy reports around this law. But I wanted in this piece to do something different, which is to take a big step back and ask, why was it that in this moment of concern about the rise of neo-Nazism, not just within Germany, but also more globally, that German politicians decided to turn to speech law as one of the main tools to try and fight the rise of hate? And so I argue in this piece that actually this is a historical phenomenon that we've seen since the late 19th century, different ways in which different German regimes, of course, they've changed radically over time, but that many different German regimes from the Kaiserreich onwards have turned to speech law as a way to try to resolve questions of hate and much broader phenomena within society. So I trace within this article, how does that really function? Why is it that happens? And I add another element, which is to show that this is often about Germany projecting itself on the world stage, going all the way back to the 1880s, when German scholars went to Japan and tried to show ways in which German law could potentially be adapted to Japan. So rather than seeing what happened with NetzDG as something that's merely a phenomenon of the last few years, if we bring the historical perspective, we can see some of the continuities in German history across this period. And then the final thing I do in this article is ask an even bigger question, which is, how do we even measure the efficacy of such a law? How do we know if it works? How do we know if attending to these hate speech posts in fact solves the problem that German politicians said they wanted it to, namely reducing the amount of hate in Germany? And it seems to me there are, of course, lots of ways in which focusing on speech law doesn't necessarily solve a lot of these problems. And we've perhaps seen that with the rise of the Querdenker and the attempted storming of the Reichstag last summer. So what I try to do in this piece then is to point towards the many other ways that we can think about contemporary laws, that we can bring in history, we can tell stories of continuity within Germany that are complex and also transnational, as Michelle pointed to. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Heidi. Our next article is a joint contribution by Manuela Achiles and Hannah Winnick. The title of their article is Memory, Responsibility and Transformation, Anti-Racist Pedagogy, Holocaust Education and Community Outreach in Transatlantic Perspective. Manuela Achiles is Associate Professor of German and History at the University of Virginia in Charlottesville, where she also directs the Center for German Studies and the European Studies program. She has published broadly on the political culture of interwar Germany and is currently completing a monograph on the political culture, on the constitutional patriotism of Germany during the Weimar years and the fascist threat. Her second research interest revolves around green practices and ideas, and she has co-edited a volume that explores the German energy transition to renewables, and she's currently working toward building transatlantic discussions on climate protection in many formats other than just publishing. The article is co-written with Hannah Winnick, who is here today from the Obama Foundation, where she is the Europe Program Manager. From 2015 to 2020, Hannah Winnick served as the founding director of the Democracy Program at the Heinrich Böll Foundation in Washington, D.C. Hannah Winnick has also served as the transnational liaison at Hispanics in Philanthropy in San Francisco, where she supported the growth of Latino-led, Latino-serving nonprofit organizations, both in the US and in Mexico. She has also spent time as a research fellow on German diplomacy with the Lead Mercator Capacity Building Center for Leadership and Advocacy in Berlin. Please join me in welcoming both Manuela and Hannah.
Thank you, Janet. So as Janet said, our article describes a partnership between the Center for German Studies and the Center for European Studies at the University of Virginia and the Heinrich Böll Foundation, which is a German political foundation aligned with the German Green Party with offices in Washington, D.C. And I want to start where our article starts, which is by talking about why we began this partnership, and that is that it was catalyzed by the August 2017 Unite the Right rally in Charlottesville. Because we as a German organization were, I think, understandably horrified to see neo-Nazis marching on American streets, chanting slogans, many of which could be traced very directly back to similar far-right European movements. And I think what really struck us at the Heinrich Böll Foundation was that this growing right-wing threat to democracy, which we were seeing on both sides of the Atlantic, was characterized by an attempt to rewrite history and to harken back to this mythical golden age of white supremacy. So that was a challenge that we very much wanted to tackle. We thought there were a lot of opportunities to take a transatlantic approach in responding to it. And we also saw a lot of opportunities on both sides of the Atlantic in that so many young people were for the first time really interested in having a more honest conversation about legacies of slavery and racial oppression and how that was shaping our democracy in the US. And at the same time in Germany, we were seeing an increasingly diverse young generation that was pushing for really new conversations about Germany's history of colonialism and ways in which you might apply this pedagogy of Vergangenheitsaufarbeitung to a broader lens of history. So that was the motivation for creating what we called the Transatlantic Partnership on Memory, Responsibility, and Transformation. It was a learning exchange between students and faculty at the University of Virginia and visiting German fellows in which they jointly explored creative and very applied ways to engage with issues of memory and historical reckoning and how they shape our democracy today. So I'll pass it to Manuela to say a little bit about UVA's motivation for this partnership.
Yeah, maybe I just start with the Center for German Studies. It was founded about 10 years ago to create space for students, faculty, and members of the Charlottesville community to explore shared transatlantic interests and events. It's an interdisciplinary unit that has the German department at its core, but includes also faculty from many other departments and programs. We had previously collaborated with the Heinrich Böll Foundation on a number of shared interests, including migration and climate protection. And in discussion of these issues, especially from the German perspective, the topic of history and memory was never far away. And in this context, it's probably important to note that UVA's own history is very complicated, combining a pride in democratic heritage, that's the Jefferson heritage, right? with the struggle to reckon with its history of slavery and the memory of the Civil War. And in this context, it's probably important to mention that two of the main organizers of the Unite the Right rally, Jason Kessler and Richard Spencer, are UVA graduates, and that their pretext for bringing the rally to Charlottesville was the city's plan to remove a number of Confederate Civil War monuments. As Hannah already mentioned, we also from the center, so we overlapped in that we also wanted to bring German practices of Vergangenheitsaufarbeitung into dialogue with the local and national historical reckoning that the Unite the Right riots in Charlottesville had sparked or intensified. And the objective was to explore together with the Heinrich Böll Foundation why societies do or do not learn from the past, and how shared challenges posed by the past and our implications into our pasts can catalyze both meaningful change as well as new forms of internationalism and long-distance solidarity. And so maybe Hannah, if you could kind of give a couple of examples.
Sure, yeah. So the way that we structured this project was that in 2018 and again in 2019, we invited a small group of German fellows to spend a 1-week residency at the University of Virginia. And we chose fellows who represented a broad range of disciplines, who brought a diversity of personal backgrounds, and who focused on different historical periods in Germany. Each fellow was partnered with 1 to 2 faculty members, and the idea was that they would create an interactive and very applied project for the students in that class. So to give a few concrete examples, Christine Umpfenbach is a German documentary theater director, and she worked with drama classes at the University of Virginia to have them do original research and interviews about different chapters of UVA history. And then the students actually developed their own documentary theater piece and performed it, in which they explored, among other things, the university's response to the Unite the Right rally. Another visiting fellow was the German Jewish writer and interfaith activist Armin Lange, who joined Manuela's class on Nazi Germany. And Armin Lange is really an activist who's interested in sort of pushing students to move out of the bystander role to take an active role in their democracy. And so he worked with them to stage public actions all across the city and on campus in which they would challenge community members to difficult conversations. So one example was a student group that went to what was at the time the only memorial to the enslaved laborers who had built the university. It was a small plaque in the stark underground hallway with fairly problematic language that was really centered on Thomas Jefferson. And they did a symbolic cleaning of this memorial and would engage passersby about sort of what the placement and the language of the memorial meant. So these are a few examples. I'll just emphasize that the one other thing that was really important to us in designing this partnership was that we wanted this to be a two-way learning street. And so we organized a whole series of conversations for the visiting German fellows to also learn about Charlottesville's history. They spoke with the public historians at Monticello, Naya Bates and Brandon Dillard, and also met with Andrea Douglas at the Jefferson School African American Heritage Center to learn about the complexity of Charlottesville's legacy as well. So Manuela.
Last but not least, maybe a couple of remarks about what's next. We want to take a group of faculty, students, and community leaders to Germany. This is going to happen in the spring of next year, if coronavirus permits it. We would like to integrate visiting fellows more deeply into the university's curriculum for longer periods of time. We would like to do more to foster and support interdisciplinary research and writing collaborations between faculty and visiting fellows. And we really want to strengthen the community engagement component and make it integral rather than somewhat supplementary. So these are a couple of ideas as to where this is going to go. Thank you.
Thank you both so much. We're turning now to Dr. Attina Grossman's article for the Journal Special issue entitled Holocaust Studies in Our Age of Catastrophe. Attina Grossman is professor of history at the Cooper Union in New York City. Her many publications include the award-winning book, Jews, Germans and Allies, Close Encounters in Occupied Germany, winner of the George L. Mossey Prize of the American Historical Association and of the Wiener Library's Frenkel Prize. Most recently, Dr. Grossman co-edited the JDC at 100, A Century of Humanitarianism in 2019. She has held fellowships from the Davis Center at Princeton University, the Mandel Center of the US Holocaust Memorial Museum, the American Academy in Berlin, the German Marshall Fund, ACLS, and the NEH. Dr. Grossman is currently working on a co-edited project on gender and the Holocaust, and her research nowadays focuses on remapping survival from 1933 to 1948, and also trauma, privilege, and adventure, Jewish refugees in Iran and India, as well as the entanglements of family memoirs and historical scholarship on the Holocaust. Thank you so much for this contribution, Attina. We look forward to hearing from you now.
Thank you so much, Janet, and thank you to Gav and the journal, and to all my fellow contributors, and also to all of you unseen participants out there. We really look forward to your questions. So my contribution sort of grew out of both scholarly and pedagogic political interests, which came together in actually sort of interesting and challenging, maybe even fortuitous ways over the period of the sort of the end of the Trump administration, and then through the Black Lives Matter summer drama, through the COVID crisis, through then the insurrection, the election, and then teaching throughout this semester in the kind of sort of post, or maybe not so post, we don't know, Trump era. And I was particularly concerned with bringing together two issues. One had to do with, as the title of my article notes, the future of Holocaust studies in our age of catastrophe, evolving in so many different ways, that I was constantly challenged by my students as they thought not only about political catastrophes, but also the relationship to climate catastrophe, very much on their minds. And so it was a thinking about changes in the way that we were studying and writing about and researching the Holocaust, a kind of remapping of our understanding of the Holocaust beyond the borders of German Nazi occupied Europe, and actually into the Soviet Union, and then further actually into a kind of globalizing of the Holocaust, a certain decentering of Europe, which then coincided with increasing demands from my students for a decolonization of their curriculum and a decentering of Europe, a less Eurocentric perspective. And within that, I was thinking very much, and with great difficulty sometimes, about how to fit the study of anti-Semitism and the Holocaust, which in so many ways was perceived as a European phenomenon, particularly by my students, into a curriculum that had less and less space for European history in particular, all in the context of a larger problem of less and less space for history and the humanities and the social sciences at all, particularly in my institution, which does not have history majors. And so realizing also that our demographic was changing with our students. They came with no assumed privileged interest in the Holocaust. They came with their own burdened histories of displacement, forced migration, genocide, that they wanted to see centered. It wasn't a question of denying the importance of the Holocaust. It was a question of where does it find its place. And that was the that was the challenge that I was trying to think about. I talked in my article about the ways in which focusing on the sort of globalized range of the Holocaust was one way of doing it, thinking about gender and particularly questions having to do with sexuality, in all of its forms, which also coincided with great interest on the part of my students, was a way of doing it. And also thinking about how we respond to this question about where does, how do we understand anti-Semitism in the context of racism? And this was sort of an ongoing challenge for me as I teach, and that was the focus of what I'm hoping to talk about today, and that I'm interested in talking to all of you about. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Attina. Our final contributor to the volume is David Myers from UCLA. The title of his article is "The Perils of Naming on Donald Trump, Jews and Anti-Semites." David Myers holds the Sadie and Ludwig Kahn Chair in Jewish History at UCLA, where he also serves as the director of the UCLA Luskin Center for History and Policy. He is the author or editor of about 15 books in the field of modern Jewish history, including, for example, The Stakes of Jewish History on the Use and Abuse of Jewish History for Life, which appeared with Yale in 2018. And it is my great pleasure today to welcome David as the final discussant before we open up for Q&A. Hello, David.
Hello, Janet. Thank you. It's a daunting task to come after these excellent presentations, but I will give it my best. I'm just going to try and start my stopwatch. So the problem my presentation takes up is naming, the naming of Jews. In this regard, one thinks of a notorious late 19th century figure, Karl Lueger, mayor of Vienna, who infamously declared, we are told, "Who is a Jew? That I determine." Naming is, of course, a constitutive act. It defines who we are. It's also about power, the power to define, permit, limit. It was and is the quintessential act of the anti-Semite, to name the Jew, a move that betrays two contradictory and characteristic features. First, its essentialism in reducing the Jew to a single fixed nature, but second, its malleability, as reflected in the manifold and often binary descriptors ascribed to the Jew: pious traditionalist versus cosmopolitan, beggar versus tycoon, communist versus arch-capitalist, to name just a few. So what prompted me to revisit this tendency at initially the AHA Roundtable devoted to the Nazi legacy in the Trump era, and then in the JHR volume? Well, there are two catalysts. First, I was interested in the tradition of naming because Donald Trump was and is a serial namer. Lying Ted, Little Marco, Crooked Hillary, Sleepy Joe, Pocahontas. And while he fashioned himself a friend of the Jews, and indeed was regarded as such by a good number of Jews, he couldn't resist the impulse to name Jews, to define them using stereotypical negative character traits. So in one notorious instance in December 2019, he told a group of applauding Jews, and here I quote, "A lot of you are in the real estate business because I know you very well. You're brutal killers, not nice people at all. But you have to vote for me. You have no choice. You're not going to vote for Pocahontas. I can tell you that. You're not going to vote for the wealth tax," unquote. A Jewish defender of Trump might explain that away, saying that that's Trump being Trump, that in fact he likes and knows Jews, that he has a Jewish daughter, and anyway, he took steps to ratchet up the defense against anti-Semitism. And this leads to the second point of interest for me here. The mirror image of the naming of Jews is the naming of anti-Semites. Trump supporters might point out that less than a week after he called Jews brutal killers, he issued his executive order, or EO, on anti-Semitism. The first part of the EO extended the web of the federal Title VI protection to Jews, previously deemed a religious group, on the basis of, quote, race, color, or national origin, unquote. The second part placed the IHRA definitional apparatus, including the contemporary example section, as the guiding frame for all government agencies. So why is this relevant? Because the EO was in its own way an attempt to define or redefine Jews, and by extension, to define anti-Semitism and its purveyors. On this reading, Jews were Jews by virtue of their national origin or affiliation, which means, I think, here their Zionism or deep connection to the state of Israel. Conversely, opponents of Zionism or fierce critics of Israel were now risked falling under the expanded or reframed category of anti-Semitism. So why does this matter? Is it a bad thing to have a political leader name Jews or anti-Semites? Well, certainly in the case of Donald Trump, I would say yes. Given the general coarseness of the language he uses, his recourse to anti-Jewish and racist stereotypes, and his dog whistling to white nationalist extremists, I think one must adopt a cautionary stance. More generally, one must recognize that the IHRA definitional apparatus on which he and the EO rely is far from universally accepted. Indeed, it now has a number of competitors in defining anti-Semitism, such as the newly released Jerusalem Declaration and the Nexus document. But here we come to a conundrum. It is far from certain that any good ever comes from state actors, either faceless bureaucrats or provocative political leaders, from Karl Lueger to Donald Trump, arrogating to themselves the right to define Jews with fixity. But there's an obverse problem. How do you protect a group if you can't name it? So what to do? Where to go from here? First, it's important to recall that naming is about power. It is an inescapably political act that establishes a clear hierarchy of namer and named. One must use it advisedly, mindful both of its contingent quality and its impulse to establish fixity. Second, when it comes to anti-Semitism, it may make sense to focus less on naming individual or group with ontological fixity and more on conduct, practices, and actions, or in this case, the often delusional images that the anti-Semite projects onto Jewish conduct. These images, from the blood libel to the protocols of the elders of Zion, often bear little relation to the lived experience of Jews, but they do animate hate. Now, one might say that this is what the IHRA attempts to do, but this then moves to the third and final point. When assessing risk, it is important to hone our powers of discernment to determine where the real danger lies. In the current moment, there's a huge amount of attention directed at criticism of Israel, but this seems to me disproportionate. The far greater danger, in my view, are white nationalist, supremacist, and neo-Nazi agitators plotting and attempting the murder of Jews. It is on them, or more appropriately, their actions, conduct, practices, and misrepresentations that we should be focusing. Thank you.
Thank you so much, David. Time now in our discussion to make it interactive with our audience and with the roundtable panelists themselves. I will start with a question for Robert Tobin that's come in. Robert, Evola seems too influential not to be more widely known. Why is he not better known, in your view?
He really is very, very obscure. It's extremely, it's hard to find his books. His books are sold in the United States in New Age bookstores. I think there are a couple reasons. I think that whereas certain German thinkers actually become, I don't want to say they're more prestigious, but their notoriety has become stronger despite, or perhaps even because, the connection with the Nazis. So I'm thinking of Heidegger or Carl Schmitt. That has worked for the Germans well. I think the Italians have dropped off, partly just because of the state of Italian studies in the United States, which seems to me to be even more parlous than German studies. But also, the other issue with Evola is that he really delves into the not very rational sides of fascist thoughts. So he's very interested in all kinds of things that you might find in New Age stories. He's interested in psychic phenomenon and astrology. His approach to race is very strange. There's this whole vision of this Hyperborean Nordic culture from which all the great cultures come, and that settled Atlantis, and then from Atlantis they go over to Rome and set that up. And I think that that's a little bit hard for even for even far-right thinkers to swallow. But I also think that that is actually an angle that we can use. We can bring this stuff out. We can say, okay, so maybe you were attracted to the idea that it's not just a matter of Jewish biology, but also there's a Jewish way of thinking that, yeah. But do you realize that the guy who said that, also thinks that Atlantis was a real thing? So I think maybe that might be that sort of bizarreness of his thinking might be helpful.
Thank you, Robert. A question has come in from Michelle, and it's from our good friend and colleague, Jen Evans in Canada. Michelle, Jen is asking, in Canada, there seems to be a connection between long-standing German-Canadian communities in southwestern Ontario and parts of British Columbia, post-1945 German immigration, and the nurturing of the homegrown far-right Canadian neo-Nazi groups, which sought out connections to Germany in the 1970s and the 1980s. Do you, Michelle, see similar things in the US context in terms of where these groups are located and how they organize?
First, hi, Jen, how are you? This is a really good question. It's tough to answer. So on the one hand, if we take the case of Gary Lauck and the NSDAP-PAO, they're located in Nebraska in the middle of the Farm Belt. Lauck was from Wisconsin, and his obsession with Nazism was in large part because he was ethnically German. He considered himself like an Auslandsdeutscher first, like a German abroad first, and American second. And he actually wanted to become German, stylizing himself in that way. There's obviously a lot of other neo-Nazi organizations historically that have been in largely German, ethnically German parts of the United States. Like in Detroit is the national, one of them is in Detroit. But I think what I find most interesting is that there's so many of them in the American South, because in the United States, you also have the connection between the KKK and neo-Nazism and anti-Black racism. So there's more in the American South where there are less ethnic Germans. And then there's also oddly a lot kind of scattered throughout larger population centers, like even California. There's been some really important organizations there, including the Institute for Historical Review. So I can't say now if there's some kind of correlation, but I think I don't know, it's a really interesting question and I have to think more about it, but thanks for it.
Well, we can loop back to it later, Michelle, for sure. A question has come in from Rachel Dean Ruzika. It seems, she says, like there's an interesting overlap between David Meyer's presentation and Heidi Tworek's. How can we address the question of naming when also thinking about attempts at regulating hate speech? This, she says, may also overlap into Michelle's points as well, as we need to name outside of our country's borders simultaneously. I suppose that's a question for three.
Well, I guess I'll jump in. I think it's really an important point and one I think about a lot, because in thinking of a more effective regime to combat against anti-Semitism and engaging in the cost-benefit analysis of excessively confined definitional apparatus of what a Jew is or what an anti-Semite is, I think we quickly come up against the problem of particularly in the case of anti-Semitism in the 21st century, the free flow of toxic ideas, especially on the internet. And I was very interested to hear Heidi begin to talk about that. Here, I think that, again, the question is less about government action in naming a particular group with any beyond the initial sort of broad category that can really reflect and speak to the potentially aggrieved status of a group. not drilling down and defining what within that broad category actually merits protection in terms of beliefs of that group, as I think the executive order does by really homing in on Zionism and anti-Zionism. But after that initial broad act of naming a potentially aggrieved group, I think we do have to focus our attention on actions, conduct, practices, and representations. And that brings us, I think, very quickly to how we can delimit or protect against hateful and toxic speech. And that's really a matter of thinking through even more regulating the vast unregulated entity known as the internet, which sort of transcends boundaries, doesn't just move between the United States and Germany, it transcends all boundaries. That is its virtue, but also its great liability in terms of regulating when it comes to this toxicity. So for me, that becomes a very thorny, vexing issue of balancing against the very freedom that the internet embodies and the doctrine of and principle and ideal of free speech on one hand, and the dangerously unregulated nature of the internet in transmitting not just toxic ideas, but actual manuals for engaging in mass murder. So what do we do there? Again, I would focus less on groups and individuals and more on practices and conduct in thinking of a regulatory regime. So I'll stop there.
Yeah, maybe I'll jump in and say I think it's a great question because it also gets to some of the ways that companies themselves, social media companies themselves, are already moderating content, right? And the way that they actually are the actors exerting a huge amount of power, because as they've come under increasing amounts of pressure, they have started to use, a substantial amount of AI alongside human moderators in appalling conditions, as we know from books and work by people like Sarah Roberts, who's based at Center for Critical Internet Studies. So here, the power of naming in many ways accrues to social media companies that often use word lists and keywords as a way to pre-filter which posts will be deleted or not. And we have some sense that some of the words that they're using are probably quite troubling from a freedom of expression perspective, at least from some of the research that this ends up, for example, with more people discussing things around, for example, Islamophobia getting deleted than people who are propagating neo-Nazi and far-right hate. So this power of naming in many ways we see actually accruing to the social media companies who are deciding how they're going to moderate content. So in many ways, you can think about Netzdg as a state attempt to wrest some of that power away from companies. But one of the ironies is that it puts the burden on the companies themselves to look at all of these posts. And what actually ended up happening when you delve into the transparency reports that come out of this law is so you as a user, let's say, I say something that David thinks is illegal, he clicks to complain on that post, then it goes to that social media company to adjudicate within 24 hours. And what we see is the first thing they do is they don't run it against the German law, they run it against their own terms of service. And the vast majority of things that are deleted under the company's own terms of service, even though David has flagged this because he thinks that it's illegal under these 22 statutes of German speech law. Only in the tiny minority of cases where something doesn't contravene the terms of service, but then might be illegal under these 22 statutes of German speech law, is it taken down under German law. So I think that's just an illustration of how this law had a kind of unintended consequence of giving greater power to social media companies to do this naming. And the final thing that I'd say is that in the kind of public policy work that I'm doing, one thing that I'm trying to push for is the insertion of civil society groups, and particularly marginalized groups who haven't had the opportunity to really represent themselves in front of social media companies and governments to discuss the ways in which they are abused or they see hate speech as functioning. An example in Canada being Indigenous groups, right? But there are all sorts of other coalitions of Black groups and so on who bring up a whole host of other names, but often aren't given the chance to actually speak. So if we think about some of the at least public policy work I'm trying to do is to figure out who actually gets the chance to even be in the room to discuss these kinds of naming practices, whether to say that there's too much deletion in some cases, or there hasn't been enough in terms of attending to certain types of hate. So this, I think, is a really crucial element of what's going on with contemporary internet content moderation.
Michelle, did you have something to add on to that? Then I will proceed to a question that is directed for Attina, Manuela, and Hannah. The question comes from Elena Hoffenberg, and she says, I would be curious to hear the speakers reflect on the thread of connection between the Holocaust and colonialism. She says this question is inspired by the challenge presented to decolonize the curriculum, as Professor Grossman's students call to do, and also placing American-German exchange and influence in the realm of imperialism, as we heard with the presentation and article from Manuela Achilles and Hannah Winnick, and its critique given the US international influence, especially after the Second World War, and also explore the relationship between, she says, anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism in contemporary definitions. So it's a very broad question. If you'd care to comment, please first, Attina.
Yes, that is a very broad question. And I think the very last piece of it, I'm going to send over to David. Yes, in terms of decolonizing the curriculum and bringing in questions of imperialism, and for that matter, slavery and racism, I think that the key sort of opportunity and difficulty is to be able to link, to compare, to make connections without effacing distinctiveness and difference. And that's why I do think that the nature of Holocaust education in many ways does have to change, although that does differ from institution to institution, how much space one has. In my institution, we have very little space for humanities and social sciences education in general. However, one of the interesting actually effects, I think, of this summer in particular, following already on an increased interest in questions to do with what is fascism, how do we define it, but particularly also Black Lives Matter, is that in a way it opened up more curiosity for thinking about histories and genealogies of racism and imperialism. And so for me in my own research, but also in the way I try to think about teaching, one way to do that is indeed to follow what we have been calling a kind of, maybe imperial turn, a decolonizing, a decentering turn, a turn in Holocaust studies, which is to look at, for example, the experience of Jewish refugees from Nazism who were escaping from a European racism that ultimately, resulted in genocide, in genocidal racism, and then found safety or temporary refuge in non-Western colonial or quasi-colonial sites, where ironically they, escaping for their lives, coming from traumatic experience of racism, found themselves in a privileged position in a very different context of a kind of racialized colonial racism that ironically gave them white skin privilege. Now, that does not mean that we stop teaching about, the center of the final solution, that we stop thinking about, obviously, what the Nazi program of extermination was about. But it does mean that we make some very difficult decisions about how much space we allocate to the center and how much we think about the periphery, and bring in real experiences that are part of the Holocaust, whether it is the majority of Polish Jews who surviving because they ended up in the Soviet Union and then ultimately in Central Asia, predominantly Muslim area, or whether it was people, in my case, studying Iran and India. If we can bring those questions into the curriculum, I think that it offers us opportunities, and then students start to make links, for example, between anti-Semitism and white supremacy, which is something I write about in my piece and I'm still struggling with. So I think I'll hand it over to my fellow thinkers.
Manuela and Hannah?
Manuela, shall I go? Do you want to take a first stab at it?
Please
Okay.
go.
All right. I think for us, and again, I'm speaking not from an academic perspective, but really much more sort of from a practitioner's perspective. One of the big challenges that we were thinking about as a political organization that was focused on really civic engagement and civic education and political education was, how do you keep making the lessons of the Holocaust relevant to, as Attina was saying, like an increasingly diverse American population, also an increasingly diverse German population that didn't necessarily see any link in their own personal history to that history. And so for us, just sort of trying to draw the red thread between, you know, where did this Nazi racial ideology originate? How is it connected to, you know, German colonialism, to the genocide of the Herero people in Namibia, and where do we see that through line into Nazi racial ideology? And then how does that shed light on, you know, in Europe in 2015, when you saw the refugee crisis and all of the rhetoric and the language that was used there. And I think being able to make those connections suddenly made the Holocaust history a lot more interesting and made it feel a lot more relevant and immediate for, you know, young Germans of color. Certainly when we were working with students of color at UVA, that was often the first time they had heard about German colonial history. And it was really interesting to think about, well, what does that mean for, you know, today's activist connections between an Afro-German community and the African-American community in the US. So I think it's just opens up a lot of new conversations that are really exciting. And interestingly, I think provides a framework, at least when we were thinking about the project, to keep making the history relevant, because then when you had the murder of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor, those conversations fit in a really different way when you've sort of broadened the historical lens.
Maybe I can just add that I'm overwhelmed by seeing all these links and all these conversations that we can have, and that I would really recommend everybody who's here, kind of recommend to everybody to read these essays and see kind of these things. I want to kind of say in particular about Attina's article that it really makes me think about how I teach my Nazi German class. And I would probably take it to heart and revamp it, right, in conversation with you. So, and that is one step that's really important. What I want to add to this is what we were trying to do is, while it really is important to think about centers and peripheries, right, kind of to think about how our vocabulary changes and our knowledge changes, and how maybe the periphery is already always in the center. And so we want to accommodate all of that, right? And kind of think about our vocabulary, and then kind of these kind of processes of naming and how we name ourselves, right? That becomes also kind of require some reflection in a way, and to move forward. But what I wanted to say about where Attina's article also what we do that goes maybe add something to what Attina is saying, is that we were really interested in action and in local contexts. So while I can see that I can kind of rewrite my syllabus and kind of start thinking with you, I can still think that I want to integrate what we do to bring the students to their local contexts and to enable them to do something. And that is context specific. That is specific to the locality and to the sense of urgency that the students are feeling at that very moment. I cannot direct this. And so we gave the students also always options. Then they chose their projects. That's what came out of it. And it might not have been what I wanted them to do, but it was inspired what we have done. That's clearly so, but they chose to kind of do their projects on what was relevant for them at that very moment at UVA, post 2017. And that might be the next year, it might be a different thing, right? So, but you know, to have them make that step to kind of becoming active was difficult for them. It was difficult. It's not always asked from them to actually think, what do I do now? But that was exactly the question that we had in the aftermath of our discussions and teach-ins after 2017, that we taught and we had great conversations, and then the students raised their hands and they asked, well, what do we do, right? What do we do now? So it's a question about doing. It's about a question about realizing their citizenship, of becoming resilient, of being curious, of engaging. And that is what I wanted to say, that how I can see what we did to be kind of complementary to what you are doing, how this kind of can enrich, these kind of two perspectives can really enrich each other. So that's all I have to say.
Thank you. What I'm going to do now, before I advance to a question from Rosemary Pena and also one from Jonathan Skolnick, I want to just loop in another aspect that Elena Hoffenberg was asking about and loop back David into the conversation. Please, David.
Yeah, I wanted to just say a word about the question, the last part of Elena's question about anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism. And I think the simple answer to a very complex question is that I think anti-Zionism can be anti-Semitic. For example, when it invokes the praxis of naming, when, for example, people say, well, Jews aren't a people or a nation or a collective in sort of a national sense, but only a religion. That kind of arrogation of the right to name the other sets off alarm bells in me, and may indeed qualify in my lexicon as anti-Semitic. But I do think there has been a very substantial overreach in the equation between anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism as the conversation has evolved in a highly politicized environment. In that regard, I think the IRJ takes us to a certain level. It certainly is successful in inspiring conversation. We now have other alternatives with the Jerusalem Declaration and the Nexus document, neither of which is perfect, but rather than regarding the IRJ and the new entries in zero-sum terms, I think we should regard them as perhaps better in dialectical terms and pushing us and agitating towards an ever more refined understanding. Just to give one very particular example, so if determining that Jews are not a nation or people, but rather a religion, may tread onto the terrain of anti-Semitism, what to my mind does not, something which is often cast as an anti-Zionist form of anti-Semitism, the assertion that the state of Israel should not be a Jewish state or a state of the Jews. That's really a matter of a kind of political vision that may indeed rest on some of the most noble values we know, like the principle of equality and democracy for all. Just as I wouldn't say that someone who holds to the view of the United States as a Christian nation is necessarily a bigot in holding that view. It's a view I don't agree with, but I wouldn't say that it's a manifestation of bigotry. So I wouldn't say that asserting that Israel is a Jewish state or is not a Jewish state necessarily falls into the category of anti-Semitism. So I think, you know, again, moving away from the ascription of fixed identity to an individual or group, focusing on practices, content, and representations of the other. I think that's the terrain we should tread on. And in doing so, I think we can indeed make distinctions between anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism. There are moments of overlap, but also very substantial differences between the two.
Thanks, David. I'm turning to a question now from Rosemary Pena, who is the inaugural president of the Black German Heritage and Research Association. And the question is directed openly, but it seems perhaps most pertinent to our discussions just now on curricula rebuilding and rethinking and reconceptualizing. So her question is, do you ever consider including the experience of Black people in Germany during this period. Perhaps Attina and Manuela and Hannah can chime in first on this, or primarily.
Absolutely, yes. That the experience of Afro-Germans in Nazi Germany is part of what we talk about. There are, of course, some very interesting and important memoirs. But again, what I think what was so striking to me, and this is was sort of one of the points that I kind of was a hook for my article, was the discussion in my classes of sort of the meaning of Aryan and non-Aryan, and what kind of racial exclusivity the Nazis were trying to establish. So that I was so struck in my class when we read the Nazi Party program, and my students sort of immediately got, of course, the selectivity of it, the racism, the fact that this was a national socialist program, where the privileges of citizenship, the privileges of welfare, some of which, like, free schooling, for example, was something that they had been fighting for themselves. But what they did was that whenever there was a reference to what was clearly anti-Semitism, they read it and spoke it as white supremacy, because that was their point of reference. And that then leads into a conversation about what kind of racism was directed in Nazi Germany, quote, not only towards Jews, but towards people of color generally. And of course, then also we had a discussion about the unfit, the quote unquote, the asocials, the experience of non-normative sexuality, and how we sort of see that as part of a larger program of Aryan supremacy, but also looking at the differences in the ways in which Jews in particular and other undesirable, quote unquote, or non-Aryan groups were treated. And so I think that, again, it's a question of being able to bring in those experiences, but also being able to make the distinctions. And it's also this very practical problem that I keep coming back to, because I teach non-majors who have very sort of vocational interests, even as they are extremely politically aware, and many of them, in fact, most of them, of non-European sort of family origin. Is what kind of decisions do I make about, what do we read? And I think that, Manuela's point, and so pass it on, I think, the point that Manuela was just making about, considering local contexts and also giving students the opportunity to make their own decisions about, okay, how am I going to try to untangle this for myself? How am I going to, make this experience, feel more real in ways that are maybe different than going out, to a demonstration, which many of my students did very actively this summer, but that has a practical import. So I'm actually very, I'm very inspired. I wish I had your resources at the University of Virginia, but very inspired by the kind of syllabus that you're presenting. And certainly, I think there's a lot of collective learning that we can do here.
Hannah, would you like to respond?
Sure, yeah, I'll just say I think it's a great question, and I feel like it's an area in which Manuela and I also had a lot of learning and could do a lot more in. But the two fellows we had who were Afro-German out of the group of 10, one really focused on decolonizing German streets. And so it was more of a focus both on the activism today and German colonial history. And the other she was both a filmmaker and a communications expert. And so one of the projects that she did, and she did a number of different ones with the students, was to show her own film and have a discussion with the community about it. And in that, she talked about 8 different Afro-German women and artists. The film was called Millie's Awakening, and really sort of showed their experience as Afro-German women in Germany. And what I think really struck me when we had that community discussion was that for so many people, I think in Charlottesville, certainly for a lot of the students, it was a totally new idea that there were Afro-Germans at that time. And so it was really like a beginning of a conversation that I think there was lots of room to go deeper into. And maybe to say one way in which we were hoping to go deeper into it, and Manuela is carrying forth this next year of the partnership, is to bring a lot of these community partners, including the partners at Monticello, at the Jefferson School for African American Heritage, to Germany, and to actually, work with them to shape that agenda about, what would be relevant for these community partners to discuss in a German context. And I think in that sense, when they do that trip to Germany, that would be a really important topic to cover.
Can I jump in, Janet?
Of course you can, Robert.
Sure, yes. So I've just
had a question lined up for you just after the next one too, but probably.
I would like to respond to this question about Black Germans and the Holocaust, just because I've had experience with it in 2 classes recently, a January sort of winter term course on German Jewish culture and modern multiculturalism in Germany, and then this semester course on nationalism. And this semester we were reading some excerpts from Patricia Hill Collins, and she talks about internal racism and external racism, and mentions the Jews in Nazi Germany as a group that move from internal subordinate members of society to a group that is to be exterminated. And a number of our students, very politicized, didn't like that, because they were like, Jews are white, this is not racism. I think it was informative to discuss that with them. And so I was really interested to hear what David said about the anti-Semitism of saying the Jews aren't a people, because I find also in the January course, many of my students really want to see Judaism as a religion, and they are somewhat reluctant to make that comparison to the Jews as a folk. And actually, for my course in January, it was really important to see the Jews as a folk and to sort of understand folkish identity and what that could add to our own discussion of racism today. I just think it's been useful for me to work through these issues, and I'll just leave it at that.
I'm going to move quickly and ask for briefer responses. The question that I have from Jonathan Skolnick is primarily for Michelle and applicable also for Heidi. He's asking about the cross-border study of anti-Semitism and the far right, also encompassing Scandinavian and especially Eastern Europe interests. To what extent are links on the far right between, for example, Germany and Eastern and Northern Europe particularly significant now? And I think both of you can answer that in your chronological context, Michelle, observations today, and that ties in nicely with Heidi's paper on the media.
So obviously today, the links between German and Scandinavian, Eastern European far-right movements are crucial, especially as these movements continue to gain steam in electoral politics, right? That these are not fringe anymore, but they're growing in terms of who's actually being voted into the parliament. I want to step back and focus on my time period a bit, which is 1970s through 1990s. In terms of Scandinavia, there are fascinating connections there. Denmark in particular was important because it borders with Germany, and that was one of the places where Lauck and other neo-Nazis could kind of hide out while they were about to smuggle things into Germany. Lauck was actually arrested in Denmark in 1995 and then extradited to Germany to be sentenced. In terms of Eastern Europe, my period is during the Cold War. So it's very, very interesting here that these ties are primarily a Western European and West German phenomenon because of Cold War divisions. I'm continuing to expand the scope of my research to figure out more global connections, but the most difficult part has been Eastern Europe, because it was under socialism and communism. So I am definitely excited to look more into that.
Yeah, I mean, maybe I'll just say briefly that in terms of legislation, I would take this to an even more kind of global view, which I do in the article, which is to see the ways in which Netzdige was appropriated by both democracies, but also a whole host of authoritarian regimes in ways that I think give us pause about it as legislation. So, for example, the Russian parliament actually copied and pasted various paragraphs of Netzdige. We've seen that also happen in Turkey, adopting some of the rules, Thailand, and actually there is a civil rights organization based in Denmark called Justitia, which put out a paper looking at the ways in which Netzdige became a kind of template for authoritarians worldwide. So I think I'd answer the question by saying it's actually a more global phenomenon.
Thank you both. A question coming in from Edward Westerman, asking about masculinity, and I'd like to refer this to you, Robert, primarily. Are there linkages between some of the neo-Nazi movements and the reenactor communities that reenact World War II in militia regalia, including SS regalia? Also, are there some conclusions we can draw related to masculinity or masculine ideals of these organizations?
I don't know a lot about the reenactor committee, but that makes a lot of sense that there would be those kind of connections. What I am noticing is that in these far-right illiberal thinkers, obviously there still needs to be a government, right? And it's not going to be just one person is going to rule everything. And so what they like are bonded groups of men. And so this is kind of the, so organizations like the military, in some cases the church, police organizations, where men are going to get things done, and then they're bonded very intensely and at times erotically. I'm working very carefully here because I don't want to say all gay men are fascists or all fascists are gay men, but I do think there is a subcurrent of erotic connection that was discussed more explicitly pre-Evola and pre-fascism. Nowadays, it tends to be hidden, but I think it's there.
I'm going to end with a concluding question posed by Kathy Turner for anyone in the Zoom room to ponder. She's wondering about the similarities between the Holocaust in Germany and the history of slavery of African Americans in the United States. How would you frame the possibility, she asks, of the United States moving toward an anti-racist reality? Would you even say it's possible? Would you say that a country like Germany has perhaps evolved to a point beyond anti-Semitism, or is it still very much an active issue?
Well, I'll bite, but I think there are a lot of problems with Germany today, so I'm reluctant to say that it has evolved. I mean, I think it's different, so it has evolved, but it's not beyond anti-Semitism. However, what I tell my students and what did help in the discussion of the relationship between the Holocaust and the slavery experience is that I think that we in the United States can learn a lot from German memory culture. There are certainly things that the Germans haven't gotten right. But, you know, as I said, imagine if next to the White House there was a huge, complex, difficult, controversial memorial to slavery. You know, that would be a great thing. You know, imagine if there were Stolpersteine in front of every one of those beautiful white mansions in the South saying how many slaves were there. Those would be things we can learn. So I think we can learn from Germany. I'm not going to give them a blank check.
And I'll just jump in and say, in fact, there's a book that takes up precisely this question, that Susan Neiman's Learning from the Germans, which makes many of the same points that Robert just mentioned. And I would say that two very key points that were indeed checked off in Germany in the wake of the Second World War were recognition and responsibility. Recognition of the crime and acknowledgement of responsibility. And those are two very important steps that we still have to make our way to, though it is important to know that a first reading of H.R. 40 has passed the United States Congress, and that's a very encouraging and important step towards the path of coming to terms with our own criminal past.
I would jump in and say that, yes, indeed, in terms of memory culture, and also in reference to reparations and this question of, what can Wiedergutmachung, what can compensation mean, and what can it not mean? There is a great deal to talk about. There's a great deal also in terms of sort of the question about Afro-Germans, and also African American history. I think there's a great deal to talk about the post-war experience and the reflections, for example, of African American GIs who were stationed in Germany, and also the reflections of writers like Du Bois, who are thinking about the confrontation with the Holocaust, or if we're thinking about sort of imperialism, the ways in which the African American community talked about the double V campaign. How do you fight against fascism at the same time that you struggle against racism, which is not that dissimilar to what was happening in British colonial territories such as India. So I think that's really interesting and important for us to think about. I also would just quickly want to add, however, that what I find most, in some ways, helpful and also, difficult is what is happening in Germany now, and it's already been referenced, which is that after kind of apparently relatively successful sort of confrontation with the past, at least in West Germany, Germany now also faces this challenge of how do you make a history perpetrated by Germans in which there's been a kind of official acknowledgement that the entire society was implicated. How do you take that, which is kind of like a national common sense, and transfer that to a new Germany, which indeed is much more multicultural, which also includes so many people who do not have that genealogical connection. And how does one sort of, again, transfer this idea of we are all responsible for living in a post-slavery society, whether our ancestors were killed in a concentration camp or not? We as Americans living here are living in a post-slavery society. What does that mean for people who come from Syria, from Turkey, from all over the world, who are now living in a Germany that is suffused with a memory culture that is now becoming their own, but is not as simply their own as that of those who we would call Bio-Deutsche. And that I find really the most interesting point of comparison right now, and the most useful.
Can I maybe add to this, Jen?
We are probably out of time, so this is our out of time comment by Manuela.
I just add very quickly that from Hannah and my project, we think probably, Hannah, I don't know whether I can speak for you, but there's a lot of power in a preposition, and we have preferred to talk about learning with the Germans rather than learning from the Germans. And
yes, that's a phrase you mentioned it in your paper.
As to Attina's comment, I think, or also to David's point, maybe Michael Rothberg's book on implicated subjects, implication, and multidirectional memory might give an answer to this that goes in a slightly different way than Susan Neiman's book. So that's just
absolutely. The two taught in tandem expand our horizons greatly. Susan Neiman's book and Michael Rothberg's book. learning from the Germans, or as Manuela and Hannah's article reframes it somewhat as learning with the Germans, in relation to Attina's comments just now, and Michael Rothberg's The Implicated Subject. I am so grateful to Alexa Asher and to Anat Weiner at the Journal of Holocaust Research. I'm also grateful again to Gav Rosenfeld, who, by the way, is organizing a roundtable at the German Studies Association's conference in late September, early October in Indianapolis with Susan Nyman on precisely these issues. The conversation continues. Our journal issue is about to be made available. Please read it, and please join me in thanking everybody on our panel today, our contributors to the special issue, Confronting Hatred. Thank you so much.